A lonely cowboy bought pregnant woman sold by her husband, then found a miracle he never knew he needed. The sun blazed overhead like a punishment sent from the heavens, hanging high above the cracked earth of Dust Hollow, where even the weeds had given up trying to grow. Heat shimmered off the dry ground, distorting the line between where the dust ended and the sky began. A group of men stood in a loose semicircle at the edge of an open field behind the old rail station. No signs, no banners, no law. Just boots grinding into dirt, eyes narrowed beneath sweat-stained hats, and a silence thick with complicity. In the center of the circle stood a woman. Her name was Evelyn. She was barefoot, her ankles dust-caked, and her faded cotton dress clung damply to her back. Her belly swelled round and taut beneath the fabric, unmistakably 7 months along. Blonde strands stuck to her forehead, and her shoulders trembled under the weight of heat and humiliation, but she held her head high because she had nothing left to lose. Next to her stood Troy, her husband in name only, a wiry man with a flask always near and a laugh that sounded like spitting gravel. He grinned, lifting one hand as though auctioning off a fine mare. "Hard worker," he drawled, his voice slurred but clear enough. "Don't talk back. Don't eat much. Got a baby in the oven too. Hell, that's 2 for the price of 1. He barked a laugh, looking around as if waiting for admiration. No one laughed. No one stepped forward. A few shifted their weight, spitting into the dirt or pretending to glance elsewhere. Even in Dust Hollow, where decency was more rumor than rule, this was a line most weren't willing to cross. Troy scowled. "Come on now, don't go all moral on me. You all know what the world's like. Ain't no room for dead weight. I'm giving someone here a bargain, and I'm getting myself some freedom. She's yours, for whatever you've got in your pockets." Evelyn didn't move. She didn't plead. Her arms wrapped around her belly like it was the last shield she had. The sun beat down harder, and the silence thickened until it felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Then a voice came from the back, low, steady. "I'll take her." Heads turned, boots shifted, eyes squinted toward the rider who had spoken. He sat on a lean bay horse, one hand resting loosely on the horn of his saddle. A battered hat shadowed most of his face, but not the lines of sunburn that ran deep along his jaw, nor the stillness of a man who had seen more than he ever spoke. His name was Silas Hart. Folks in town remembered him from years back, before the war, before the silence, before he took to the Timberhorn Range and lived like a ghost among the cattle and trees. He dismounted slowly, dust swirling around his boots as he walked forward. His coat was patched, boots worn, but the way he moved, deliberate and calm, made the air shift. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth pouch. The coins inside clinked softly as he dropped it at Troy's feet. Not bills, not papers, just weight. "That's it?" Troy sneered, glancing down. "You call that an offer?" "It's everything I've got," Silas said quietly, "and it's more than—" "She deserves to stand here one more minute." Troy opened his mouth to argue but faltered when Evelyn stepped forward on her own. She didn't look back at the man who sold her. She looked at the stranger instead, the man who hadn't even asked her name and said, "Why?" Silas met her eyes. He didn't smile, didn't touch her, just spoke the truth in a voice that barely cut through the heat. "Because you're not a thing." That was all. He turned and walked back toward his horse. Evelyn stood frozen for a heartbeat longer, then followed. No one said a word. Not even Troy, who bent to gather the pouch with a muttered curse. The crowd parted in silence, the dust rising behind the woman and the man as they rode into the blinding sun, away from the field, the shame, and the past. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn didn't feel sold. She felt saved. The wagon creaked beneath them as the wheels turned over dry earth and stone. Silas kept a steady hand on the reins, his eyes forward, his lips silent. Evelyn sat beside him, shoulders drawn in tight, one hand resting on her swollen belly as the other gripped the side of the seat for balance. The road was long, winding away from Dust Hollow into the untamed hills, and silence lay thick between them, heavier than the heat they left behind. She had not asked where they were going. She did not know if she even cared. All she knew was that she had stepped down from one kind of hell and into another kind of unknown, and the man beside her, though not cruel like Troy, was still a stranger. As the sun began to lower behind the ridgeline, shadows grew longer, stretching like fingers across the path. Trees rose up now, tall pines crowding the road, their needles whispering in the evening breeze. By the time the light began to fade, they had left the road altogether and followed a narrow trail that wound through dense woods, damp with moss and heavy with the scent of cedar. At last they arrived. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a small clearing, made of hand-hewn logs darkened by time and weather. Its roof was sloped low against the mountain winds, and smoke rose from the stone chimney in a lazy, curling thread. There was no fence, no sign, no welcome mat, just a wooden step, a porch with one old chair, and a stillness that belonged to forgotten places. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt, set the brake, and stepped down without a word. He walked around, reached up, and offered her his hand. Evelyn hesitated, but accepted it. He helped her down with care, his touch steady, not possessive. Still, she did not meet his eyes. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and old soap. The walls were lined with shelves holding tins, jars, and folded blankets. A stone hearth sat cold at the far end, and a small table stood near the window, flanked by 2 chairs. The floor was swept clean, though time had warped a few boards. It was sparse, but not unkind. Silas pointed to a bed tucked into the corner, its frame handmade, the mattress covered in a quilt stitched from faded patches. "You can rest here," he said simply. Then, without waiting for response, he stepped back outside and headed toward the small barn down the hill. That night, Evelyn lay on the bed, still in her dust-covered dress, her boots beside the door. She did not undress. She did not sleep. She listened to the crickets, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the wind stirring the trees. She expected the sound of boots on wood, of doors opening, of commands barked in the dark, but they never came. When dawn broke, a pale light slipping through the shutters, she sat up to find the cabin empty. The front door was ajar, letting in a breath of cold air. On the table was a wooden bowl of steaming broth, a thick slice of brown bread, and beside it a folded scrap of paper. She picked it up with shaking fingers. "You owe me nothing." The handwriting was blocky but neat, written in pencil on torn parchment. Evelyn stared at the words for a long time, then, without touching the food, she set the note down and walked outside. Silas was in the barn, mucking out stalls. He looked up briefly, nodded once, and returned to his work. She turned and walked back inside. 3 days passed. She didn't eat. The second morning, another bowl of soup and slice of bread appeared on the table. The third, it was a baked potato with salt and butter, still warm from the coals. The note stopped after the first. Evelyn stayed in the cabin, watching the fire when it burned, sitting still when it did not. She slept little. Her belly ached sometimes, the baby twisting inside her like it too didn't know if it belonged. She drank water but little else. Hunger was a familiar thing now, something she knew how to ignore. But on the 4th morning, she woke to a different ache, a deeper one, the kind that clawed at her ribs and made her head spin when she stood. She sat at the table, staring at the bread. Her hands shook, her eyes burned. She reached out, picked it up, and bit into the crust. And something inside her cracked. It wasn't the pain of hunger, nor the fear of strangers. It was the warmth, the quiet, the absence of demand. Tears streamed down her face as she chewed, the taste simple but real. She clutched the bowl in both hands, sipped the broth, and let the salt mix with her own. "I'm still a person," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm still someone." And outside, in the barn, Silas kept to his work, never asking, never watching, only being there, steady as the hills that surrounded them. The days passed like low clouds over the mountains, slow, heavy, and quiet. Evelyn moved through them with the kind of caution that comes from long exposure to pain. Each morning she folded the wool blanket neatly at the foot of the bed, tidied the cabin, and stepped outside to help with chores without being asked. She gathered firewood, swept the porch, and sometimes took a small pail to fetch water from the stream that curved like a silver thread beyond the pines. When she moved, she held her belly with one hand, steadying herself against the dull ache in her back. She spoke little, not from fear anymore, but from habit. The silence was familiar, less dangerous here, but no less deep. Finn, the boy, watched her. He was 9, maybe 10, with unkempt brown hair and eyes too large for his face. They were solemn eyes, as if he'd been watching the world too long for his age. He rarely made a sound. When he moved, it was like wind through grass, quiet, quick, easy to miss. He never ran, never yelled, never played the way other children might. Evelyn didn't ask questions. Children like that weren't born, they were made, by something that had broken before anyone could stop it. The cabin became a rhythm. Silas worked in the fields or the barn, fixing harnesses, patching the roof, tending to the cattle. Evelyn kept the hearth warm and the bread rising. Finn wandered between the two of them, a small shadow that belonged to both and neither. Then one afternoon, as the sun sat high and sharp in the sky, Evelyn was hanging clothes behind the cabin, pegging a blanket to the line with fingers numb from the cold stream. She turned and found Finn standing nearby, holding something in his hands. It was a small wooden board, rough but sanded at the corners, a square of soft pine no bigger than a book. In his other hand, a stub of blackened coal. Without a word, he stepped closer and held it out to her. She took it gently, unsure what to expect. On the board was a drawing, childlike, uneven but clear. 3 figures stood beneath the slanted roof of a house, one tall with a cowboy hat, one smaller with wild hair, and one round-bellied woman with a braid down her back. She stared at it, her throat tightening. Finn reached again, took back the board, and scrawled a few more words beneath the figures. His hand was quick, practiced, though not quite steady. Then he turned it back toward her. "He saved you because he couldn't save my mama." The world tilted for a moment. The trees around them swayed, though there was no wind. Evelyn looked up, but the boy wasn't watching her anymore. His eyes were down, focused on a rock near his feet, like he'd said too much and regretted it. Evelyn knelt slowly, the fabric of her dress catching on dry grass. She reached out, hesitant at first, then sure, and placed her hand over his small fingers still holding the board. Finn looked up. And for the first time since she had stepped into this place, she smiled, not the weak, polite kind she'd worn for years, but a real one. Soft, trembling. "True. Thank you," she said, her voice catching. "That's the kindest thing anyone's ever drawn for me." Finn blinked. He didn't smile, but his eyes warmed. She let go of his hand, gently, like releasing a bird that might fly off if startled. That night, she set the board beside her bed. Later, after the fire had died down and the cabin was dark but for the moonlight slanting through the window, she sat awake, running her fingers across the edge of that drawing. Her mind echoed with the boy's words, not spoken but etched. "He saved you because he couldn't save my mama." She hadn't known the story, but now she didn't need details. She understood. Silas hadn't bought her to own her. He had acted from something deeper, something unfinished. Grief with calloused hands and a quiet voice. And now a little boy who hadn't said a word to her in days had bridged a distance she hadn't dared to cross. She looked toward the other side of the room, where Silas slept in the corner chair, head tilted against the wood. He'd given her the bed, always. Tomorrow, she decided, she would bake something sweet. Maybe honey biscuits, if she could find flour enough. Not to pay back, not to earn her place, but because something had changed. She was no longer a guest. She was becoming part of the drawing. By the time the first frost kissed the corners of the cabin windows, Evelyn had found a rhythm. Each morning she stoked the hearth before the sun broke the ridge, kneading dough while the fire warmed the kitchen. The smell of rising bread and sweet cornbread began to linger in the cabin, weaving itself into the walls like a quiet song. Finn would rise early too, watching her silently from the doorway, until she handed him a small task, grinding salt with the mortar, tying bundles of kindling, checking the traps near the brook. She taught him how to weave simple fishnets using cord pulled from old sacks, their hands working side by side on the porch as the wind shook golden needles from the pines. Silas never said much, but he noticed. One afternoon he rode back from the upper pasture with fresh timber in the back of the cart. By nightfall, he'd nailed new beams across the front of the cabin, extending the roof by a few feet. The next morning, Evelyn found a bench under the new shade, a spot to sit in the golden hour, her basket of thread beside her. She hadn't asked for it, but it was there. She began sewing again, mending first, then patterns, then little things. A cloth rabbit for the baby, a shawl for Finn's narrow shoulders. Her fingers, once stiff from months of fear, remembered how to create. It was during one such afternoon, as she sat embroidering a tiny daisy onto the hem of a muslin baby blanket, that she finally asked him. Silas was working not far, patching the side of the chicken coop with old planks. His sleeves were rolled past his elbows, and sweat gleamed along the edges of his brow. "Silas," she said softly. He paused, but didn't look up. "Don't you want to know who I am?" There was a long silence, broken only by the creak of wood and the chirp of distant crickets. "If you want to tell me," he said finally, "I'll listen." He straightened then, brushing sawdust from his hands. His voice was low and steady. "But if you don't, the past ain't what makes a person, it's what they do now." Evelyn stared at the thread in her lap, the needle frozen mid-stitch. Her lips parted, but no words came. She didn't tell him, not that day. Instead, she watched him return to the coop, shoulders broad and unburdened by expectation. He didn't ask again. The next morning, the creek near the cabin gurgled louder than usual, and Evelyn saw that the old water wheel downstream, once stuck and rusted, was turning again. She followed the flow to the millstone behind the cabin and found it freshly greased, spinning slow but smooth, fed by a cleared channel of water. She turned and saw Silas standing up the slope, wiping his hands on a rag, avoiding her gaze. He didn't say a word, but she knew. He'd fixed it for her, so she could wash the linens without stooping in the freezing stream, so she could turn the wheel and scrub the clothes of her small family like a woman who belonged. Later that evening, she watched him from the window as he chopped firewood in the waning light. His movements were precise, methodical, the rhythm of a man who kept his thoughts tucked inside like a letter never sent. And she thought, this man didn't just save her. He saw her. He chose her. Not because she was helpless, not because he wanted something in return, but because somewhere in the quiet, aching places of his own soul, he recognized her pain and did not look away. That night, as she set the table and Finn lit the lanterns, the scent of warm apple bread filled the room. When Silas stepped inside, he paused for a moment at the doorway, his face touched by firelight and the faintest surprise. Evelyn placed the bread on the table, met his eyes, and for the first time she smiled before he could. "It's sweet," she said, "like the silence here." He didn't smile, but something softened in his face. After supper, while Finn sat by the fire, carving a stick into the shape of a bird, Evelyn wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped onto the new porch. The stars above Timberhorn Ridge were sharp and countless, the kind of sky that only the wilderness remembers. She rested her hand on her belly, feeling the life inside her shift, gentle and calm. Behind her, Silas stood quietly in the doorway. "You ever think," she whispered, "that maybe the world gives us one more chance than we deserve?" He didn't answer, but his presence said enough. So she whispered to the night, to the trees, and to the child still waiting to be born, This isn't where I was taken. She looked toward the stars, then back toward the warm cabin. This is where I was chosen. The sky was gray when they set out that morning, Finn walking ahead with a rope basket slung over his back, and Evelyn just behind, one hand on her belly, the other on a walking stick Silas had carved for her. The air was cold, sharp with the promise of early snow, and the wind stirred the branches overhead like quiet warnings. They were gathering kindling along the ridge behind the cabin, where dry wood could still be found tucked beneath the pines. Evelyn moved slowly but steady, scanning the ground for fallen limbs, while Finn darted ahead, quick and nimble among the rocks. She was reaching for a crooked branch caught between two stones when her boot slid. It happened fast, a twist of her ankle, a sharp jolt up her spine, and then the hard ground rushing up to meet her. She hit with a dull thud, her hand scraping across dirt and pine needles. The breath whooshed from her lungs, and pain coiled in her belly like a knife. Finn dropped his basket and ran back. "Go get Silas," she gasped, clutching her stomach, already feeling the wrongness blooming inside her like a storm. Finn turned and vanished into the trees, his small legs moving faster than she'd ever seen. By the time Silas reached her, she was curled on her side, blood darkening the hem of her dress. He didn't ask questions. He lifted her into his arms, cradling her with a gentleness that belied his strength. She sobbed once, weak and breathless, as he carried her down the trail, whispering words she couldn't make out, just the low hum of reassurance wrapped in the scent of pine and fear. Inside the cabin, he laid her on the bed, stripped off his coat and moved with swift, practiced precision. Water into the pot, fire stoked, cloth torn, whiskey uncorked. The years he had buried, the medic's hands, the battlefield instincts, rose to the surface like breath through still water. He boiled water, soaked linens, cleaned the wound with trembling fingers. The bleeding was slowing, but her face was pale, her breaths shallow. He dabbed sweat from her brow, changed the cloth under her back, and sat beside her as night crept through the shutters. Finn curled on the floor nearby, clutching his blanket, eyes wide and unblinking. Evelyn drifted in and out of sleep, wincing with each stir of pain. Sometime past midnight, her hand reached blindly into the darkness. Silas caught it, laced her fingers in his. Tears slid down her cheeks. Her lips moved, cracked and dry. "I'm not worth this," she whispered. "Not for you, not for anyone." Silas didn't look away. "I've already lost one," he said, voice low and hoarse. "I was there, but too late, too tired. I thought I had more time." He swallowed hard, the memory thick in his throat. "I held her hand when it went cold, and I swore, never again." Evelyn closed her eyes, but more tears came. She held his hand tighter, the pressure weak but fierce. "Why do you care?" she asked, almost a breath. He shook his head slowly. "Because this time, I had the chance to choose." They stayed like that for hours, her trembling, him unmoving, Finn silent nearby. When the dawn light bled across the horizon, it found them all still there. Evelyn wrapped in blankets, her skin no longer ashen, Finn asleep at the foot of the bed, one hand still on her leg, and Silas, eyes bloodshot, watching her chest rise and fall like it was the most fragile thing in the world. The bleeding had stopped. The baby still stirred. Hope had not left them. Not yet. The wind began howling just after sundown, tearing through the trees in long, low cries. Snow blew sideways across the clearing, blanketing the porch in minutes. Timberhorn had not seen a storm like this in years. Inside the cabin, Evelyn moved slowly in front of the fire, one hand on her back, the other on her belly. She had not spoken, but Silas knew. He had seen the look in her eyes, the way her breath hitched with each rising pain. "You feelin' it?" he asked. She nodded, jaw tight. "Every 5 minutes." "No doctors coming through that snow tonight," he said. "I know." He added wood to the fire, then began boiling water, laying towels, spreading blankets on the bed. The wind slammed against the windows like fists. Finn stood near the table, clutching the oil lamp, eyes wide. "Stay close," Silas said. "I'll need you." Finn nodded. When Evelyn staggered with the next contraction, Silas caught her and laid her down gently. He wiped her brow, held her hand. She trembled. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I," he replied. For the next hour, the cabin became a flurry of hushed commands and quiet bravery. Silas moved with the precision of a soldier, guiding her breath, changing cloths. Finn helped without a word, towels, lamp, thread. When the moment came, Evelyn cried out into the blanket, fists clenched. The wind howled. And then, a baby's cry, raw and real. Silas wrapped her in a towel, hands shaking, and passed her to Evelyn. She held her daughter close, pressing her lips to her damp forehead, crying softly. "She's here," she whispered. "Finn's here." Finn stepped forward, notebook in hand, watching the baby settle in her arms, the firelight casting a soft glow over them all. "What's her name?" Silas asked. Evelyn looked down, voice thick with tears. "Mira, because she's a miracle, something no one can own." Silas looked away, his throat tight. As the wind began to calm, Finn climbed onto his stool and drew quietly. When he finished, he handed Evelyn the paper, a drawing, her, Silas, and the baby beneath falling snow. He pointed to the baby, then to Evelyn. "You weren't bought," he said. Evelyn looked up, startled. "You were chosen," he added, "just like her." Tears welled again. She reached out and pulled him in, his small head resting just above Mira's. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, beside a fire burning warm and bright, something greater had taken root. A family, born not of blood but of choice, of pain survived, of love discovered, and of a girl named Mira, born in the heart of a storm. The days after Mira's birth passed gently, like ripples across still water. The storm had left the land blanketed in white, but inside the cabin warmth clung to every corner. The baby slept in a small cradle Silas carved from pine, nestled near the hearth where the fire never truly went out. Evelyn, though tired, began to heal, her color returning, her steps growing steady again. Each morning she bundled Mira in wool and hummed as she moved through the house. She took to teaching Finn lullabies in her soft, untrained voice, old songs about stars and rivers, about brave cowboys and gentle mothers. He listened with rapt attention, his eyes wide, sometimes mouthing the words, though no sound came. At night they gathered near the fire. Evelyn told stories, some true, some dreamed up, while Silas sat quietly in his chair, whittling, listening without ever interrupting. Then came a day, near the end of winter, when the sky was clear and golden. Evelyn had just finished hanging the last of the diapers to dry when Silas approached her without a word. In his rough, calloused hand was a small object wrapped in cloth. She looked up, brow furrowed. "What's this?" He didn't answer, just handed it to her, his gaze steady. She unfolded the cloth. Inside was a simple leather bracelet, dark with age but carefully treated. On the underside, carved so faintly it was barely visible, was a single word. Libre. She traced the letters with her thumb. "Spanish," she said quietly, "for freedom." He nodded. "Found the strap from a cavalry satchel. Been carrying it for years. Never knew why I kept it." Evelyn stared down at the bracelet. Her throat tightened. "You think I need reminding?" "No," he said. "I think you already know. I just wanted you to have it." She looked up, meeting his eyes, something tender blooming behind her ribs. The weight of the gift wasn't in the leather, it was in what it didn't ask of her. No chain, no clasp, just a symbol. She slipped it onto her wrist, the fit snug but easy. Then she said, softly but surely, "Silas." He straightened slightly at her voice. "I don't owe you anything." "I know, but I'm staying," she said, and the words filled the air like spring. He blinked once. "You don't have to. I want to." She stepped closer, her voice trembling with truth. "Not because I'm grateful, not because you saved me, but because I choose you. I choose this place. I choose us." For a moment, He didn't move. Then he nodded, barely, and something in his chest unclenched. They didn't embrace. They didn't kiss. But later that evening, as the sun spilled gold across the ridge, they stood together on the porch, watching the light fall through the trees. Evelyn held Mira close, the baby nestled beneath her chin. Silas stood beside her, arms crossed, his shoulder just brushing hers. Their hands found each other, without effort, without announcement. No promises were spoken, no vows made, but the way their fingers wove together said enough. She was no longer passing through, she was home. A year had passed, the snow had come and gone twice, and the path leading to the cabin now held the deep, honest grooves of living. The garden behind the house grew carrots and herbs. A chicken coop stood sturdy near the back fence. And Mira, toddling on uncertain legs, made her slow, triumphant march across the front yard, arms raised for balance, curls bouncing as she laughed in delight. Finn followed close behind, a little older, a little taller, strumming a small banjo Silas had carved for him from old maple. He plucked the strings shyly, not for show, but because the sound made Mira dance, and she did. Tiny feet stomping in place, mouth wide in a giggle that made the cabin feel like it had a heartbeat. Inside, the scent of cornbread and stewed apples filled the air. Evelyn stood near the table, sewing needle in hand, bent over a wooden sign. The letters were small but steady, stitched carefully across a soft cloth backing, mounted to a slab of pine. When it was finished, she hung it on the front of the cabin with 2 rusted nails. The words read, "No one buys what's priceless." Later that afternoon, a traveling peddler came by, riding a tired mule and asking for directions to Dust Hollow. He paused when he saw the sign, tilting his head. "What's that mean?" he asked, pointing. Silas, sitting on the porch, whittling a toy horse for Mira, looked up, his knife pausing mid-stroke. "It means," he said quietly, "that she ain't for sale." The man chuckled. "Who wrote it?" Silas ran a thumb along the grain of the wood. "Someone who used to think she was a thing to be traded. Someone who learned she never was." The peddler nodded, tipping his hat, and moved on. Evening fell soft across the timber line. The pines swayed in the breeze, and the last of the light turned the hills gold. Evelyn sat in the rocker on the porch, Mira curled against her chest, breathing slow and steady in sleep. Finn sat cross-legged beside her, picking out a lullaby on the banjo. His head bobbed slightly with each note, his eyes calm, his silence no longer heavy but peaceful. Silas remained near the steps, whittling in the fading light, the shavings piling at his boots. Every so often he looked up, not at anything in particular, just at them, at his family. There were no blood ties here, no papers signed or names changed. But there was choice, and in that choice they had built something truer than any law or lineage. As the stars blinked into the sky above Timberhorn, Mira stirred slightly in her mother's arms. Evelyn rocked her gently, then looked out at the world around her, the hills, the home, the boy who had become a brother, the man who had become everything. She whispered, just for herself, "I was never bought." And Silas, hearing her, though she had not spoken loud, whispered back, "No, you were found." The fire crackled, the music played, and the mountains held their breath for a while longer, watching a family forged not by chance, but by choice. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that family is more than blood, and that love often shows up in quiet acts of choosing, then you're in the right place. At Soul Stirring Stories, we share tales just like this, of hope found in unexpected places, of healing where pain once lived, and of people who remind us that miracles don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come on horseback, carrying nothing but kindness. If you want more stories that make you feel, breathe, and believe again, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because sometimes the story you need most finds you when you least expect it. This is Soul Stirring Stories, and we're just getting started.